So as I've said before, efficiency doesn't say a whole lot about fairness. It's a pretty minimal requirement in terms of how we allocate resources. So there are efficient allocations that are not fair in any reasonable sense of the word. So the example I've given you for that previously was that we could give everything to Rob, or we could give everything to Friday, and such an allocation would be considered efficient. But again, no reasonable sense of the word fair would describe either of those allocations as being a fair allocation. So what this says is that Pareto efficiency is not a discerning enough criterion, right? So it's a criterion that rules out a lot of allocations as being undesirable because there would be gains from trade. We could reallocate in a way that makes everyone better off, but it's not a stringent enough criterion. Right? So among these Pareto efficient allocations, we want to be able to pick some allocations, but we don't know how to pick uh, the best one, right? And the notion of what is the best one isn't clear. So when we move from one Pareto efficient allocation to another, we make some people better off and others worse off. So if we draw a quick picture here, right? So we've got our contract curve here. As we move in this direction along the contract curve from this point to this point to this point, Rob's made better off and better off, whereas Friday gets worse off and worse off. And conversely, if we move in this direction, Rob is worse off and Friday is better off. So what you could do is you can write down what's called the utility possibility frontier. This set of all possible utility levels for both of the consumers at all the different Pareto efficient locations. So when society, so we can then define the welfare of society as a function of both Rob and Friday's utility levels. Right? So we can define a social welfare function. Now, there's lots of different types of social welfare function, and I'll give you a few examples in a moment. Right? So when we say social welfare function, think of this as there's a there's a person who is responsible for society, or there's an individual uh, whose preferences reflect those of society, and that um, this person has a preference over how the utility is distributed among the different consumers. So, for example, this person might say, well, listen, giving 0 utility to Rob and 100 utility to Friday is better than giving 100 utility to Rob and 0 utility to Friday. So this would be a society that prefers giving everything to Friday over giving everything to Rob. That's just one example of a welfare function. So here's some examples that are some more serious examples that we see a lot that have come up a lot the among philosophers and show up a lot in economic analysis. The the most important one is the utilitarian social welfare function. So the social welfare from Rob getting utility of UR and Friday getting utility of UF is just the sum of UR and UF. So you can think of this society as seeing the utility of Rob and Friday as being perfect substitutes. Right? So what a society that has a utilitarian social welfare function wants to do is just to maximize the total sum of everyone's utility. So Bentham and John Stuart Mill, these were philosophers who proposed and supported this idea of social welfare. Now, you don't have to necessarily remember the utility numbers don't necessarily mean anything, but suppose they do, we could add them up. You could also weight the utilities differently. So let's suppose we want to favor Rob over Friday. Then rather than just adding up their utilities, right? So this would be just adding up their utilities. We could weight those utilities. We could multiply Rob's utility by some coefficient, alpha r, and Friday's utility by some coefficient, alpha f, such that alpha r is a bigger number than alpha f. That says Rob's utility has a higher weight than Friday's utility. Now, another utility social welfare function is to say that these utilities are essentially perfect complements. So what this says is that the society wants to maximize the welfare, the utility of its worst off member. So John Rawls said, a society is only as well off as its worst off member. Now, this type of a social welfare function is going to promote a notion of egalitarianism. It's going to want us to stay close to the 45-degree line in terms of the optimal distribution of utilities, right? If you remember, if you go back to how we maximize a perfect complements utility function, the optimal bundle is usually going to be on the 45-degree line. Similarly, here, the optimal distribution of utilities is usually going to be where we have equal utilities for the two consumers. And that's what we call egalitarianism. We want to treat all the consumers equally. Now, under the first of these utility social welfare functions, giving everything to one person and nothing to the other person would be utilitarian. It would be a utilitarian, it would maximize social welfare under the utilitarian criterion. However, it would actually be the worst thing you could do under the Rawlsian criterion, because if we give everything to Friday, for example, then this would be zero. Rob's utility would be zero. So the minimum of the two would be zero. So this is the worst you could do. You couldn't do any worse than that. So the Rawlsian utility social welfare function it promotes fairness in the sense that we often think about, whereas a utilitarian social welfare function doesn't quite. Okay. Now, in general, we could basically draw a picture where we plot a curve through all the points on the utility possibility frontier. And then we could also draw the equivalent of indifference curves for these utility distributions. So we draw a curve through all the pairs of utilities for Rob and Friday such that the social welfare is W bar. And we do that for all W bars. And this gives us something very similar to an indifference curve. So they'd be indifference curves of society. So let's take an example here. Here we've got this curve, the utility possibility frontier, where it doesn't necessarily have to be a nicely shaped curve, but we get this curve where, again, we look at all the possible Pareto efficient allocations and we look at the utilities that Rob and Friday get, and we plot those to get this curve. So A would correspond to the allocation where Friday gets everything, Rob gets nothing. C would correspond to the allocation where Friday gets nothing, Rob gets everything. Now, we could, like I said, we could draw the equivalent of indifference curves. So these would be, we could call them ISO welfare curves. So an ISO welfare curves. And that's what these guys are. So this would be the ISO welfare curve when social welfare is W1, this would be for W2, and this would be for W3. And the higher the social welfare, the higher the curve would be, just like indifference curves. And if we wanted to maximize social welfare, we would do what we normally do. We look for the highest ISO welfare curve, so the highest level set. So this is often called a level set. We look for the highest point, the point that gives us the highest social welfare that is on our utility possibility frontier. And that happens to be this point B. Again, it's just very similar to the idea of a consumer picking the bundle that gives her the highest utility or is on the highest indifference curve. So take, for example, the utilitarian social welfare function, then the ISO welfare lines are going to just be slopes, lines. ISO welfare curves are going to be lines of slope -1. So these are just like the perfect substitutes and difference curves, right? So again, we take the same utility possibility frontier, but with this particular social welfare function, the ISO welfare lines are going to be these lines of slope -1. So for this social welfare function, the optimal bundle, it's not a bundle, it's a distribution of utilities. The optimal distribution of utilities is going to be D. That's where the sum of Rob and Friday's utilities is maximized. Now, if we had instead done this with the Rawlsian utility function, or the Rawlsian social welfare function, well, we would look at the 45-degree line, and remember the indifference curves would be L-shaped, and they would have the corners lined up along those 45-degree lines. Right, so the ISO welfare lines would look like this. So the optimal distribution of welfare would be this point right here. So that's the efficient allocation, that's a Pareto efficient allocation where the utilities are equal. So the utilities would be equal.